The reception was still in full noise when Frederick Hartwell raised his glass. Champagne caught the candlelight along 100 crystal stems, and the string quartet had just finished a waltz, and the room was warm with the particular warmth of people who believe they have witnessed something excellent. Josephine stood at her husband's side in ivory silk, her dark hair dressed with a single strand of garnets her grandmother had left her, and she was smiling. The kind of smile a woman assembles when she has been assembling smiles since the age of 12. Frederick was easy in the way. He was always easy. Shoulders back, glass raised, the faint pleasure of a man who knows the room is listening. His father stood 3 feet to his left, already beginning to grin, because he had heard the line before and had always found it funny. Frederick let the silence build for exactly the right number of seconds, and then he said it. "Any woman would be lucky to have me." His father laughed. 3 uncles laughed. 2 of Frederick's oldest friends from Cambridge laughed, and someone near the back made a sound of appreciative agreement, and the room generally agreed that it was a fine, self-deprecating toast, the kind a man makes when he is confident enough not to need it taken seriously. Josephine's smile did not change. Her eyes did not change. She lifted her champagne glass, and she drank from it. And then she set it down on the table beside her, with a precision that had nothing accidental in it. The deliberate, quiet, final sound of a decision being made. She did not look at Frederick when she set it down. She did not look at anyone. She turned, smoothed the front of her gown with one hand, and walked toward the staircase at a pace that suggested she had simply remembered something she needed to attend to. She did not hurry. That was the thing that stayed with Frederick afterward, in the days when he replayed it. She did not hurry. She went up the stairs at the same measured pace she used for everything, and no one in the room appeared to notice, because the champagne was still moving, and the quartet had started again, and the 100 witnesses to this good match had found other things to attend to. Upstairs, Josephine opened the wardrobe in the room she had occupied since the wedding. Not the room they had shared, but the room she had kept for her own use, where the shelves held the deed documents and the enrollment ledgers and the correspondence from 3 counties. And she began to work. She pulled the first trunk from beneath the bed and opened it flat on the floor. She did not look at the ceiling, or out the window, or at the photograph on the writing table. She opened the wardrobe and began to select what she needed with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had already made her decision before she set the glass down, and perhaps before that, and perhaps before the wedding itself, in the way that decisions sometimes wait quietly in a person until they find the moment that confirms them. The trunk filled in an orderly way. The correspondence files first, sorted by county and by year, bound in their ribbons. Then the deed documents in their leather case. Then the enrollment ledgers for the autumn term. Then 3 changes of day clothes, 2 evening things she would need for meetings with patrons, the winter coat she had brought from her father's house when he died, the writing case her headmistress, Miss Arden, had given her on the school's 3rd anniversary. She worked with the window dark and the sounds of the reception still rising faintly from below. The quartet, the laughter, the particular bright noise of people who do not know they are alone in a room. By the time she opened the second trunk, the reception sounds had shifted to the lower register that meant guests were beginning to leave. By the time she sealed the third, the house was quiet enough that she could hear the carriages on the gravel below. She sat down at the writing table and drew 2 sheets of paper toward her. The first letter was to Mr. Graves, her solicitor, whose firm handled the deed of trust for the school and the management of the property rents her father had left her outright. She told him she would be residing at the school in Buckinghamshire for the foreseeable future, and asked him to direct all correspondence there. She did not explain why. Mr. Graves was a man of sufficient professional discretion that she had never needed to explain things to him, and she saw no reason to begin now. The second letter was to Miss Arden. It was shorter. It said, "I will arrive in the morning. Please have the small room at the end of the east corridor made up. I will take the third form lessons on Friday while you are in Oxford." She sealed both letters and set them on the corner of the writing table where the footman would find them. Then she stood, put on her coat, picked up her gloves, and looked once around the room to see if she had left anything she would want. She had not. She went downstairs. The last carriage was pulling away from Hartwell House when Josephine walked out the side door and found the hired cab she had sent for 2 hours earlier, before the toast, before the glass was set down, at the moment in the afternoon when she had understood with a certainty she could not quite name that the evening would end this way. The driver was patient. The night was dry and cold. She gave him the address of the coaching inn in Kensington, where she would spend the night before the morning journey to Buckinghamshire. And she settled into the cab. And she did not look back at Hartwell House. Downstairs, Frederick was still in the dining room. The servants had begun to clear the tables. He made a remark to the footman about the champagne, something easy, something that should have produced a smile. And the footman smiled correctly and carried on clearing. Frederick looked at the door to the staircase. He made a second remark, this one to himself, and it landed in the empty room without producing anything at all. He sat down in one of the dining chairs, still in his evening coat, and he was very still for a long time. 3 days passed at Hartwell House with the specific quality of days in which a man tells himself that a situation is not yet what it appears to be. Frederick sent a footman to the school on the first morning with a note asking Josephine to name a time convenient for them to speak. The footman returned in the afternoon with no answer, and the explanation that Lady Hartwell had been in lessons and was not available to receive visitors. Frederick wrote a second note and sent it by post. It was not answered. On the third day, a letter arrived from a firm of solicitors, not Frederick's firm, but a different one. The name printed on the envelope in a typeface he associated with institutional correspondence rather than personal matters. The letter was addressed to Lady Josephine Hartwell, care of Hartwell House, and had been forwarded from the school. He stood in the hall with it in his hand for a moment, then set it on the tray for the afternoon post to be redirected. But the name of the firm had registered, and it continued to register, in the way that a fact continues to work on a person after they have set it aside. On the fourth day, he rode to Buckinghamshire himself. The school occupied a converted manor house on a lane outside the village, and it was larger than he had expected. 3 stories, 2 wings, a stable block that had been converted to something else, a kitchen garden that was clearly productive. There were girls in the yard when he arrived, 2 of them carrying slates, one of them engaged in what appeared to be a serious disagreement with a bush. He dismounted, handed his horse to the stable boy who appeared from the converted block, and walked up the front steps. The entrance hall was clean and high-ceilinged and smelled of chalk and beeswax and the particular dry warmth of a building that is heated for occupation rather than for show. A girl of perhaps 14 was sitting on a bench near the window, a slate across her knees, working through a column of figures with the focused efficiency of someone who has been told she has until 10:30. She did not look up when he came in. "Good morning," Frederick said. "Good morning," said the girl without looking up. "I am here to see Lady Hartwell," Frederick said. The girl looked up then, She regarded him with the calm assessment of someone who is not impressed by height or good tailoring. And she said, "Lady Hartwell is in the 3rd form lesson until 10:30. Have you an appointment?" "I have not," Frederick said. She replied evenly. "Then you may sit on that bench," the girl said, and returned to her figures. Frederick sat on the bench. It was a hard wooden bench, the kind designed for function rather than comfort. And he sat on it for 40 minutes while the school moved around him. Footsteps in corridors, a voice from somewhere above him reading aloud in French, the distant sound of a door closing with purpose. The girl with the slate finished her column of figures, checked it, and moved to the next. At 10:23, she got up and left without speaking to him. At 10:30 exactly, Josephine appeared at the far end of the hall. She was wearing a dark gray dress, practical, without ornament, and she was carrying a folder of papers under one arm. She walked toward him at the same measured pace she used for everything. She stopped at a distance that was correct without being warm. "Frederick," Josephine said. "Josephine," Frederick said. He had prepared something to say on the ride from London, and now he found that it had been prepared for a different version of this meeting, one in which he had the advantage of standing in a space he knew. He was not standing in a space he knew. "I wanted to speak with you." "I am available on Thursdays," Josephine said, "between 2 and 4. If that is convenient, you are welcome to come then." She looked at him steadily. "I have the 4th form lesson in 3 minutes." "The 4th form lesson," Frederick repeated. "Geometry," Josephine said. "They are working on proofs." She shifted the folder of papers to her other arm. "Thursdays between 2 and 4, Frederick. I'll ask Miss Arden to note it." She turned and walked back into the school. Frederick rode back to London on the same horse, and he did not make any remarks to anyone for the duration of the journey. And when he arrived at Hartwell House, he went directly to his study and sat at his desk without lighting the lamp for longer than was strictly necessary. The Thursday visits began the following week. Josephine had told Miss Arden about them plainly, in the way she told Miss Arden everything. "Frederick has parliamentary connections that the petition will require before spring. I intend to use them. He will come on Thursdays." Miss Arden had said, "I see," in the tone she used when she understood something completely and intended to say nothing further about it. Josephine had nodded and returned to the enrollment figures. She did not tell Frederick any of this. She poured the tea herself when he arrived on the first Thursday at precisely 2 o'clock. She was surprised enough by his punctuality that she had not yet asked the kitchen girl to bring it. And she watched him register the fact of her doing it with the faint adjustment of a man who has just discovered that the landscape is not what he expected. She pushed the first of the petition documents across the desk toward him before he had finished settling into his chair. "The petition requires a named parliamentary connection," Josephine said. "Not a sponsor, not yet. A connection who can advise on the language before we submit. The deed structure for girls' institutions currently falls under a different legislative classification than boys', which creates a funding vulnerability we need to address before the endowment grows further." She turned the document to face him. "I need to know whether the language in Clause 4 will survive a committee reading." Frederick read Clause 4. He read it again. He said, "This is a legislative petition." She answered simply. "Yes," Josephine said. "This is a serious legislative petition," Frederick said. "Yes," Josephine said, and waited. He asked about the deed of trust. She showed him the original document, registered in her grandmother's name, 1841. funded by rents from the property her father had left her outright in his will, bypassing the usual settlement arrangements because her father had been a man who read the law carefully and loved his daughter specifically. Frederick read the document with the attention of someone who has just understood that the floor is considerably lower than he thought it was. "When was this registered?" he asked. 1841, Josephine said. "My grandmother. The school itself opened in 63 under my direction, using the existing deed structure as the legal foundation." 63, Frederick said. He looked at the document. "That is 14 years. 15, Josephine said. "As of October." He did not ask anything personal. She volunteered nothing personal, but a brief thing happened then. A thing that had no place in the conversation about deed structures and legislative language, which was that she reached across the desk for the second document at the same moment that his hand moved to pass it to her. And for one full beat, neither of them moved, because his hand was on the document and so was hers. And the desk was not wide enough to make that accidental. Then she withdrew her hand, and he passed the document, and she read the clause he indicated without remarking on it. Somewhere behind that moment, without her choosing to recall it, was a garden walk 6 months before the wedding. They had been walking the grounds at her cousin's house in Surrey, and there was a low stone wall that crossed the path. And Frederick had steadied her elbow as she stepped over it. A natural gesture, the kind a man makes without thinking. But his hand had stayed a moment longer than steadying required, and she had noticed it. And she had kept talking about the deed of trust, which was the same thing she had been talking about before the wall, because she had been explaining the school to him then, in the early months when she still believed he would ask to understand it. She had kept talking. He had listened for another few minutes, and then he had said something about the light on the garden, and the conversation had turned. The memory was brief, and she did not follow it further. She reached for the third document. The Thursday session ended at 4. He left without incident. The Thursdays accumulated. Frederick asked about enrollment figures on the second visit, and Josephine gave them to him without simplifying. 92 girls currently enrolled, drawn from 3 counties, a 4th site in Hertfordshire under discussion pending the outcome of the petition. He asked about the curriculum on the 3rd Thursday, and she showed him the document she had printed and bound herself. Mathematics, natural science, Latin, modern languages, history with primary sources, and a legislative studies module she had added 2 years ago because she had noticed that the girls who understood the law were the ones who could protect themselves with it. Frederick read the table of contents with the careful expression of a man who is revising something. On the 4th Thursday, she took him to see the proposed site for the 4th wing, a section of the school's east ground where the old kitchen garden had been cleared, the soil still dark and turned. It had rained the night before, and the grass along the path was wet. They were discussing the funding structure for the expansion when she stepped onto a patch of wet grass near the surveyor's stakes, and her boot went sideways. His hand caught her waist before she had finished losing her balance, and it held for a moment, the same quality of pause as the wall in Surrey, a gesture that had crossed from practical into something else. Neither of them remarked on it. She found her footing. He withdrew his hand, and she continued the sentence she had been in the middle of. Then the Dowager Marchioness arrived. She came on a Wednesday, unannounced, in a carriage that bore the Dunmore crest, and she was received correctly by Josephine in the headmistress's office, because Josephine received everyone correctly. The Dowager was a tall woman of 68, who had spent 4 decades being the most formidable person in every room she entered. and she sat across the desk from Josephine with the composed authority of someone delivering a verdict rather than beginning a conversation. "I will be direct," the Dowager said. Her reply was immediate. "Please," said Josephine. "An estranged wife," the Dowager said, "is a scandal. An estranged wife who operates a public institution under her married name is a scandal that reflects on the family name and on the title. I am asking you, as the head of this family, to consider what you are doing to Frederick's position." "I have considered it," Josephine said. "Then you understand?" the Dowager said. "I understand your concern," Josephine said. "I will give it full consideration." She met the Dowager's eyes without difficulty. "May I offer you tea before you go? The journey from London takes it out of the horses." The Dowager looked at her for a long moment. The look of a woman who has just assessed her opponent and found the assessment somewhat more complicated than she expected. She declined the tea. She left in her carriage with the Dunmore crest on the door, and Josephine watched it go from the window of the headmistress's office. And then she returned to the enrollment figures for the Hertfordshire site. Miss Arden appeared in the doorway. "Well," she said. "She wanted me to withdraw," Josephine said. "And?" Miss Arden said. "I told her I would consider it," Josephine said. And Miss Arden said, "Yes, I thought so," and went back to her own work. Lord Cavendish arrived on a Tuesday morning without warning, which was, Josephine reflected, a habit of powerful men who believed their arrival was itself an event worth organizing around. He was the school's largest patron. £3,000 over 7 years, his name on the library wing. And he came in with the look of a man who had made a decision and wanted to deliver it before he could be talked out of it. "The Lady Hartwell," Cavendish said, when she had received him in the headmistress's office. "I will not waste your time. A separated wife running an institution of this visibility invites the kind of scrutiny that collapses endowments. I have thought about it carefully, and I have concluded that my continued association creates more difficulty than it resolves." Josephine looked at him for a moment. "Before you decide," she said, "will you tour the school?" "I have seen the school," Cavendish said. "You have seen the entrance hall and the library wing," Josephine said. "Will you see the rest of it?" He stayed 2 hours. She walked him through the science room, where 4 girls were working through a practical experiment with glass tubes and measured quantities of water. And one of them, a girl of about 13, the daughter of a Shropshire farmer who had written to the school 3 years ago, asking whether there was any chance at all, looked up and explained to Lord Cavendish, without being asked, exactly what she was measuring and why it mattered. In the mathematics room, a girl of 15 was at the board working through a proof that Cavendish, who had been educated at Eton and then Oxford, could not immediately follow. In the reading room, 3 girls were working from primary sources: parliamentary records, actual parliamentary records from the session of 1863. And one of them was annotating in the margins with a confidence that made Cavendish stop walking for a moment. He read the curriculum. Josephine gave him the bound copy, her own, printed on the school's press. And he read it standing in the corridor outside the reading room. And she waited, and he read it to the end. Then he doubled the endowment. £6,000, he said, to be paid in 2 installments. The deed structure holds? The deed structure is solid, Josephine said. My solicitor will send the documentation. Good, Cavendish said. He put the curriculum under his arm. I am taking this. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just understood something he should have understood considerably earlier. "Your husband," he said. "My husband," Josephine said carefully, "is not involved in the school's operations." "No," Cavendish said. "I can see that." He put on his hat. "I intend to write to him." He wrote to Frederick that same afternoon. The letter arrived at Hartwell House the following morning. Frederick read it at his desk. It was not a diplomatic letter. Lord Cavendish was not a diplomatic man when he felt the situation called for directness, and he felt this situation called for considerable directness. He told Frederick that he was, without question, the stupidest man in 3 counties. He listed, in specific terms, enrollment figures, the deed structure, the legislative petition, the 4-county expansion plan, the Edinburgh's inquiry that had already arrived, asking to model their institutional structure on Josephine's. What Josephine had built across 15 years without ever once asking Frederick to notice it. He noted that Frederick had apparently been in possession of a wife who had built a functioning institution serving 92 girls across 3 counties and had managed to believe it was a pleasant hobby, in the way that a garden is pleasant. He closed by saying that he hoped Frederick was capable of understanding what he had missed, and that, if he was not, the loss was entirely his own. Frederick read the letter twice. He set it on the desk. He looked at the window. He picked up the letter and read the enrollment figures again. 92 girls, 3 counties, 15 years. And then he put on his coat, called for his horse, and rode to Buckinghamshire without sending word ahead. It was past midnight when he arrived. The school was dark except for a light in the window of the headmistress's office, which he could see from the lane. He knocked at the side door. A night servant answered, startled, and he gave his name and asked if Lady Hartwell was still working. The servant said she was, and went to ask, and came back with a look of careful neutrality and showed him to the office. Josephine was at her desk. She had her pen in her hand and 3 letters spread in front of her. And she looked up when he came in with the expression of a woman who has been interrupted in the middle of a difficult sentence and is deciding how to feel about it. She did not ask how he had come to be there at midnight. She said, "2 of the smaller patrons have hesitated. Cavendish's earlier visit, before he changed his mind, apparently reached them, and they are uncertain." "I know," Frederick said. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, without being invited. I read his letter. "His letter to me, or the other one?" Josephine asked. "The one he wrote to me," Frederick said. He looked at her directly. "Josephine, I know 3 men in the Lords who have direct relationships with both of your hesitating patrons. If you tell me what you need them to understand, I will write to those men tonight." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The petition language is what matters. If the patrons understand that the legislative protection will secure the endowment against future challenges of this kind, that it is not a personal matter but a structural one, they will hold." "Then write me the argument," Frederick said, "and I will translate it into the language that moves those particular men." She turned to a fresh sheet of paper. He moved his chair around the desk so that he could see what she was writing. They worked through the argument together. Her educational framework, his knowledge of the 3 men's specific concerns, the particular combination of principle and practicality that would land with each of them. She wrote the final versions of the 2 letters. He wrote his own letters to his contacts in the Lords, enclosing her arguments in his own hand. By 3 in the morning, the letters were sealed and stacked on the corner of the desk. The school was very quiet. The night servant had gone back to bed. Josephine stood and gathered the remaining papers into their folder. And Frederick stood as well. And they were both standing in the candlelit office, with the stack of sealed letters between them and the particular quality of stillness that settles over two people who have just done something together that neither of them expected. She walked him to the school's front door. She opened it, and the night outside was cold and clear, and his horse was waiting in the yard. She stood in the doorway, in the light from the hall lamp, her hand on the door, and she did not say anything, and neither did he. Then he went down the steps, and she watched him cross the yard, and she stood in the light a moment longer before she closed the door. Frederick offered himself formally as the petition's named co-sponsor in the House of Lords. The letter he sent to Josephine was precisely worded. He had spent an afternoon on it, and her reply came by the next morning's post. It was one sentence: "I accept and will instruct my solicitor to prepare the documentation for your review." He read it 3 times, which was 2 more times than the sentence required. The Dowager Marchioness delivered her ultimatum 4 days later, by letter, addressed to Frederick at Hartwell House. She had heard about the co-sponsorship from 2 sources before breakfast, and the letter reflected this. She told him that if he did not withdraw his name from the petition, she would make the estrangement public, not as a private family matter, but as a social fact, framed in terms that would place the origin of the scandal firmly on Josephine's side. She told him that she was protecting the family name and that she expected him to understand this. Frederick sat at his desk with her letter in front of him and wrote his reply. The first draft was too long and said several things he did not mean to say, and several others he meant too much to say well. He wrote a second draft. The second draft was cleaner. He read it twice, then folded it, sealed it, and gave it to the footman to post before he could revise it a 3rd time. The letter told his mother that he would not be withdrawing from the petition. It told her that the institution in question served 92 girls across 3 counties under a deed structure that had been legally sound for 15 years, and that he had not known this because he had not asked, and that this was a failure he intended to address rather than compound. It told her that he respected her concern for the family name and did not share her conclusion about how to protect it. It was the first written disagreement he had offered his mother in 42 years, and he was aware of this fact as he handed the envelope to the footman, and he did not retrieve it. Society responded with the enthusiasm society reserves for situations it finds both scandalous and interesting. 2 newspapers covered the petition with approval, noting the unusual combination of parliamentary title and institutional credentials at the top of the document. 3 newspapers did not cover it charitably, and one of them used the word estranged 4 times in a single paragraph. Josephine received 2 letters from patrons resigning their support. She received 11 letters of a different kind, including one from a woman in Edinburgh who ran a girls' school there, and wanted to know whether Josephine's deed structure could be adapted for Scottish institutional law. Frederick read all 3 hostile newspapers at his desk on the morning they appeared. Then he sent Josephine a note, clipped to the Edinburgh letter, which had arrived at Hartwell House by some routing error, and which he had opened before noticing the addressee. The note said, "This came to me in error. I thought you would want it immediately." Josephine read the note in the school corridor, standing because she had not had time to sit down yet that morning. She read the Edinburgh letter twice. She folded both and went to her office, and she pinned the Edinburgh letter to the board above her desk, where she kept the things she needed to see every day. And she did not reply to Frederick's note. but she did not take the letter down. On the Thursday before the board meeting, Frederick arrived at 2 o'clock and Josephine was called out of the office almost immediately. "A pupil matter," Miss Arden said, apologetically, and Josephine said she would be 20 minutes and asked Frederick to wait in the school library. He waited in the school library. It was a good room, high shelves, a long table, morning light from the east windows, the smell of paper and leather, and the specific industry of a room that is used rather than displayed. He walked along the shelves. The books were organized by subject, and the subjects were serious: mathematics, natural philosophy, history, law, languages, medicine. There was a section of parliamentary records. There was a section of institutional documentation, deed structures, legislative records, funding histories. That was more comprehensive than anything he had in his own study. And then, on the lower shelf near the window, he found the curriculum, her own, the one she had printed and bound. He took it down and sat at the long table and read it. He read it to the end, which took him the full 20 minutes and a few beyond. Then he sat for a moment with it closed in his hands. When he heard her footstep in the corridor, he took a sheet of paper from the writing materials on the table and wrote a note. He folded it and set it on top of the curriculum and left the curriculum on the table where she would find it. The note said, "I have read it twice. May I ask one question at the meeting?" Josephine came back into the library and found the note. She read it standing. She stood for a moment with it in her hand, and then she went to her office and wrote back on a half sheet of her school stationery and sent it to Hartwell House by the afternoon post. The reply said, "You may ask one." The evening before the board meeting, neither of them wrote to the other. Josephine worked in her office until late, reviewing the enrollment figures one final time, checking the petition language against the committee's likely objections, reading through the legislative argument she had been building for 2 years in the specific terms that the board would need to understand and vote on. She was ready. She had been ready for a long time. In London, Frederick sat at his desk with the curriculum open in front of him. He read the section on legislative protections for girls' institutions a second time, and then a third, following the argument she had constructed from the 1841 deed through to the current petition language. The 15 years of institutional history she had built into a case so thorough that it was, he thought, unanswerable. He sat with it open until the lamp needed trimming, and he trimmed it, and he read it again. The school's annual board meeting was held in the large room on the first floor that had been the manor's formal dining room, and was now fitted with a long table and 12 chairs and a lectern at the far end. The board members arrived at 9:30, 7 of them, including Lord Cavendish, who nodded at Frederick when he came in and sat down to one side of the room without comment. Frederick sat where Josephine had indicated, to the left of the room, slightly apart from the board, and he did not speak. Josephine stood at the lectern and presented. She presented the enrollment figures first, 92 girls currently, with a waiting list of 31, drawn from 3 counties and 3 distinct economic backgrounds, because the deed structure allowed for a sliding scale of fees that her grandmother had built into the original registration. She presented the funding structure, the rents from the property her father had left her, Cavendish's endowment, 12 smaller patron contributions, and the school's own income from the boarding fees of the 30 girls whose families could afford full payment. She presented the 4-county expansion plan, the Hertfordshire site, the surveyor's report, the projected enrollment figures for the first 3 years of operation. And then she presented the legislative argument. She presented it in full, in the precise language she had been refining for 2 years. And the board listened with the attention of people who understand that they are hearing something that matters. The argument was this: girls' institutions registered under the 1841 deed structure were classified differently from boys' institutions under current parliamentary law, which meant that their funding was vulnerable to challenge in ways that boys' institutional funding was not, and that this vulnerability had been used 3 times in the past decade to collapse endowments at schools serving working-class girls, and that the petition before Parliament would correct this by bringing girls' institutions under the same deed rights as boys, which was not a radical proposition, but a corrective one, and it was overdue. She stopped speaking. The room was quiet for a moment. The vote was unanimous. Cavendish said, "Well done, Lady Hartwell," in the tone of a man who means it specifically and not as a formula. The other board members gathered their papers. Josephine thanked them, and they filed out. And Frederick waited until they had gone. In the corridor outside the meeting room, they were alone for the first time in a space that belonged to neither of them specifically. Frederick stood with his hat in his hands and looked at her. "You said I could ask one question," he said. "Yes," Josephine said. "How long?" Frederick said. "How long have you been building this?" "I opened the school in October of '63, Josephine said. "I was 23. My father had just died and left me the property rents, and I understood that the deed structure my grandmother had registered gave me a legal foundation that I could use. I had been planning it for 2 years before that." Frederick was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Before the wedding." "Why didn't you tell me what this was?" Josephine looked at him. "I did," she said. "At the 3rd dinner, 14 months ago. I told you about the enrollment figures and the deed structure and the petition I was beginning to draft." She said it without heat, the way she said things that were simply facts. "You asked me something about the Dunmore grouse season, and we talked about that instead." The corridor was very quiet. Frederick looked at her, and then he looked at the floor. Then he looked at her again, because the floor had nothing useful to offer him. "I have no memory of it," he said. "No," Josephine said. "I know." The silence between them held everything that had happened since the toast. The trunks packed in 2 hours, the hard bench in the entrance hall, the Thursdays, the midnight letters, the circuit of all the things he had not asked and she had stopped explaining. He stood with it. She let him. "May I see the school?" Frederick said. "The whole of it." Josephine looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come," and walked back down the corridor. She took him to the science room first, then the mathematics room, then the reading room where the parliamentary records were kept and annotated. She showed him the press room where the curriculum had been printed. She showed him the map on the wall of the headmistress's office where the 3 current sites and the proposed 4th were marked in different colors. He looked at all of it without speaking, which was, she thought, the most useful thing he had done in some time. Then she took him to the library. His note was still on the table where he had left it, beside the curriculum. He saw it and crossed to the shelf where the curriculum lived, and he found the gap where he had taken it down, and he looked at the shelf. Then he looked at the copy on the table, and he picked it up, and he turned it over in his hands. "I read it 3 times, he said. "All together." "I know," Josephine said. "You told me in the note. I mean..." He stopped. He set the curriculum down. He looked at her across the library table with the morning light coming through the east windows and the smell of paper and leather around them, and he said, "Cavendish was right. About me? He was precisely right." "He used the phrase," Josephine said. "Stupidest man in 3 counties. "Yes," Frederick said. "That was the phrase." "He told me the same thing," Josephine said, "in different terms." Frederick looked at her. He had spent 6 months learning what he had dismissed, and he was still learning it. And he understood now that this was not a process with a clean end, but a permanent recalibration, the kind a man makes when he has discovered that the ground was always lower than he thought, and that the only honest thing is to stop pretending otherwise. He stood in the library she had built, holding the curriculum she had written, and he did not say anything clever or easy, because he did not have anything clever or easy left. Josephine came around the table. She stood in front of him. She looked at him for a moment with the same clear, precise regard she had given everything for 15 years. And then she kissed him. Once, briefly, her hand against his arm, in the library she had built, with the morning light on the shelves. He was very still. She stepped back. She took the curriculum from his hands and returned it to its place on the shelf. "Thursday," she said, "I will need you to review the final petition language before we file." "Yes," Frederick said. "I'll be here." The petition was filed the following week, with both their names at the top of the document. Frederick Hartwell, Viscount Hartwell, member of the House of Lords, and Lady Josephine Hartwell, founder and director, the Hartwell School for Girls, established under Deed of Trust, 1841, currently operating across 3 counties with 92 enrolled pupils. His parliamentary title, her institutional credentials, listed as equal signatories. His contacts in the Lords moved the first reading forward. Her legislative argument carried it through committee. The bill passed its first reading on a Thursday afternoon, and Josephine learned of it from a note Frederick sent to the school that arrived while she was in the middle of the second form lesson. And she read it in the corridor and went back to the lesson and did not mention it to anyone until after supper. The Edinburgh School wrote again, formally this time, with a request to affiliate and a set of specific questions about adapting the deed structure for Scottish institutional law. Josephine wrote back herself and answered the questions in full. And she copied Frederick on the letter because his parliamentary connection had been part of what had made the affiliation possible, and because she had decided, without making an occasion of it, that this was how things would work now. Hartwell House changed. A second desk appeared in the window bay of the study, positioned to face the light rather than the room, a practical arrangement for someone who worked with documents that needed to be read in good light rather than displayed to visitors. The sideboard in the dining room was replaced with open shelves, and the shelves held the school's bound records sorted by county, the Edinburgh correspondence in its own folder, and the petition documentation with both their names on the cover. The Dowager Marchioness did not visit. Frederick did not explain the changes to anyone who called, because the changes did not require explanation. One morning, a Tuesday, no particular Tuesday, with October light coming through the study windows and the smell of the season's first coal fire in the grate. There were 2 cups of tea on a single tray. The petition draft was on the desk between them, annotated in 2 different hands, his in the margin and hers in the body of the text, where she had revised the clause language overnight. Frederick read the Edinburgh affiliation clause and said, "The deed structure you've proposed for them, does it account for the difference in Scottish property law regarding institutional registration?" Josephine looked up from the enrollment figures she was checking. "It accounts for the 1868 amendment," she said. The registration process is different, but the underlying deed rights are analogous. I've asked Mr. Graves to confirm the specific language before I send the final version. Good, Frederick said. He read the next clause. And this, the funding vulnerability provision. You've extended it to cover patron withdrawal as well as legislative challenge. Yes, Josephine said. Cavendish's visit in September showed me that patron withdrawal is the more immediate threat. The legislative protection matters in the long term, but institutions can collapse in the short term from a single large patron withdrawing. I wanted the deed language to address both. Frederick looked at the clause. He looked at the way she had drafted it, the specific, careful, unanswerable way she drafted everything. He said, "May I suggest a revision to the third sentence? There's a construction in the Lords that would make this more recognizable to the committee without changing the meaning." Josephine slid the document across the desk. "Show me," she said. He showed her. She read it. She said, "That's better," in the tone she used when something was genuinely better, which was not a tone she deployed as a courtesy. And he had learned to know the difference. She took the document back and made the change in her own hand. Outside the window, the October light was steady and clear, the kind that came in the morning and stayed. The tray between them held 2 cups, both still warm. On the shelf behind them, the school's bound records stood in their county order, and above the desk, pinned to the board she had brought from Buckinghamshire, was the Edinburgh letter. The first one, the inquiry, the one Frederick had sent her with a note clipped to it and nothing more. She had moved it from the school to Hartwell House when she moved the second desk in, because it belonged with the things she needed to see every day, and it still did. Frederick asked a second question about the affiliation structure. Josephine answered it. He asked a third, about the timeline for the Edinburgh School's first enrollment under the new deed. And she answered that one too, and reached for the Edinburgh correspondence folder and opened it on the desk between them where they could both read it, and they worked on into the morning.